In the early 1950s, before the sound of jet engines became the defining voice of American air power, a quieter and more somber scene unfolded across airfields and storage depots throughout the United States. Rows upon rows of P-51 Mustangs sat motionless, their once gleaming aluminum skins dulled by dust and neglect. These aircraft had only recently returned from Europe and the Pacific, where they had been symbols of victory, air superiority, and American industrial might. Now they were surplus. After World War II ended in 1945, the United States found itself with an overwhelming abundance of military hardware and no clear use for much of it. The Mustang, once the long-range escort fighter that changed the air war over Germany, was suddenly a problem of logistics and budget rather than a tool of survival. The War Assets Administration cataloged thousands of piston-driven fighters for disposal. At bases like Davis-Monthan in Arizona and Kingman Army Airfield, aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, engines drained, canopies sealed, and logbooks closed. Some Mustangs were sold for a few $1,000s to civilians, others were transferred to Allied nations, rebuilding their air forces, and many were simply scrapped. Crews with cutting torches reduced legendary machines to piles of aluminum in a matter of hours. For pilots who had trusted these aircraft with their lives, the sight was deeply unsettling. Military journals of the late 1940s spoke openly of a new era defined by jet propulsion and strategic bombing. Aircraft like the P-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre represented speed, altitude, and modernity. In comparison, the Mustang was labeled obsolete despite its proven reliability, range, and firepower. The logic seemed sound. Future wars would be fought at high altitude against fast-moving jet-powered enemies, and propeller fighters would not survive. In this environment, the Mustang was treated as a relic of a concluded chapter. Aviation historians later noted that the rapid pace of technological change after World War II created a kind of collective amnesia where even recently vital tools were dismissed. Yet amid this rush toward the future, a small group of individuals saw something different. War veterans, engineers, and aviation enthusiasts recognized that the P-51 Mustang was more than scrap metal. Some purchased surplus Mustangs for personal use, converting them into civilian aircraft, air racers, or experimental platforms. Others worked quietly to preserve examples for museums, arguing that the aircraft represented a turning point in aviation history. In Europe and Asia, foreign air forces, including those of Sweden, Italy, and the newly formed Israeli Air Force, acquired Mustangs because jets were expensive, scarce, and required infrastructure they did not yet possess. These nations valued the Mustang for its rugged design, long range, and ease of maintenance. Meanwhile, in the United States, Air Force doctrine continued to move away from propeller aircraft. Training manuals emphasized jet tactics, and procurement budgets reflected Cold War priorities. The Korean Peninsula was a distant concern, and few planners believed it would require large-scale conventional air operations. Storage depots continued to thin as Mustangs were dismantled, sold, or exported. Photographs from this period show aircraft with their noses wrapped in protective coverings, tails marked with chalk numbers awaiting final disposition. It was an inglorious end for a machine once celebrated in wartime newsreels. Yet history rarely follows a straight line. As the world adjusted to uneasy peace, geopolitical tensions simmered. Reports from Asia hinted at instability, and the limits of jet technology were not fully understood. Jets consumed fuel at astonishing rates, required long paved runways, and had limited loiter time over the battlefield. These factors were noted quietly in internal assessments, but they did not yet alter policy. The Mustang remained in limbo, officially retired, but not forgotten. The very abundance that made it expendable also made it available. Thousands of airframes, engines, and spare parts still existed, ready to be reactivated if necessity demanded. The story of the P-51 Mustang in this period is one of dramatic contrast, from celebrated hero to unwanted surplus, from frontline fighter to scrap metal commodity. It is also a reminder that technological value is often defined by context. What seems obsolete in peace can become indispensable in war. As the jet age accelerated and Cold War anxieties deepened, events were about to unfold that would challenge assumptions and force a desperate re-examination of the past. The Mustang that America had cast aside was closer to a return than anyone realized. Type continue for the next segment. In June 1950, as the Cold War hardened into open conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the assumptions of post-war air power collapsed with startling speed. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, and within days American and United Nations troops were fighting for survival. In the early weeks of the Korean War, the United States Air Force rushed its most modern aircraft into the fight. Jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star were deployed to demonstrate technological superiority and protect the skies. Yet almost immediately a harsh reality emerged. The war in Korea was not being fought at high altitude against enemy bombers. It was a brutal ground war defined by rapidly moving front lines, rugged terrain, and desperate calls for close air support. Jet aircraft designed for speed and altitude struggled to adapt. Their fuel consumption was extreme, their range limited, and their need for long paved runways clashed with the primitive airfields available in South Korea. Pilots found it difficult to see and identify targets at high speed, and jets could not loiter long enough to provide sustained support to troops under fire. As reports flowed back to commanders, a startling conclusion formed. The future had arrived early, and the past was suddenly needed again. In this moment of crisis, attention turned back to an aircraft many believed was finished, the P-51 Mustang. In the summer of 1950, orders were issued to pull Mustangs out of storage, refurbish them, and return them to combat service. Mechanics reopened sealed hangars, drained engines were refilled, wiring was inspected, and propellers turned again. Some aircraft were flown directly from desert depots to combat zones, while others were rushed overseas aboard transport ships. Pilots, many of them veterans of World War II, returned to a familiar cockpit knowing exactly what the Mustang could do. In Korea, the aircraft was redesignated F-51 under the new Air Force naming system, but its character remained unchanged. The Mustang proved uniquely suited to the demands of the conflict. Its long range allowed it to fly from bases in Japan to targets in Korea and back. Its ability to operate from rough forward airstrips gave commanders flexibility jets could not match. Most importantly, the aircraft could loiter over the battlefield for extended periods, providing close air support when ground forces needed it most. Armed with rockets, bombs, napalm, and 650 caliber machine guns, the Mustang became a flying artillery platform. Pilots flew low-level missions, attacking troop concentrations, supply lines, bridges, and armored vehicles. These missions were among the most dangerous of the war. Flying at low altitude exposed the Mustang to intense ground fire from rifles, machine guns, and anti-aircraft weapons. Unlike jet combat, which often occurred at altitude, these attacks demanded slow, deliberate passes over hostile terrain. Casualties mounted quickly. Despite this danger, pilots trusted the Mustang. Its rugged construction could absorb damage and still bring them home. Its handling at low speed allowed precise attacks in valleys and hills. Ground troops came to recognize the distinctive sound of its engine as a sign of help arriving. Letters and after-action reports repeatedly praised the F-51 for saving lives during desperate moments. The irony was unmistakable. An aircraft deemed obsolete only a few years earlier was now indispensable. American commanders acknowledged that without the Mustang, the early months of the war could have ended very differently. As jet aircraft improved and new designs like the F-86 Sabre focused on air-to-air combat, the Mustang filled the gap no one else could. Allied air forces, including those of South Korea, also operated the P-51, adding to its presence across the peninsula. Aviation historians later described this period as a case study in adaptability. The Korean War revealed that technological progress does not erase previous solutions, but reshapes their roles. The Mustang was no longer an air superiority fighter dominating enemy skies. It was a ground attack workhorse, enduring danger to deliver results. This return to combat came at a cost, and the limits of the aircraft were becoming clear. As the war dragged on, losses continued and commanders searched for replacements. Still, for a critical window in history, the P-51 Mustang refused to fade away. It answered a call born of crisis, proving once again that relevance is defined not by age, but by necessity. In the early 1950s, as the Korean War ground on the reborn combat career of the P-51 Mustang revealed both its strengths and its painful limitations. While the aircraft proved indispensable in close air support, it paid a heavy price for that role. Loss rates among F-51 units were among the highest of any United States Air Force aircraft in the conflict. Flying low and slow over enemy territory exposed pilots to relentless ground fire, and the Mustang lacked the armor protection of purpose-built attack aircraft. Many pilots were lost not to enemy fighters, but to small arms fire that punctured radiators and fuel lines. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine that gave the Mustang its legendary performance in World War II became a vulnerability in Korea. A single bullet could cause coolant loss and engine failure within minutes. Veterans recalled watching white steam trail behind damaged aircraft as pilots raced against time to reach friendly lines. Despite these dangers, missions continued because there were few alternatives. As the war progressed, newer aircraft, like the F-80 for Thunderjet, began to assume more of the ground attack burden. Jets improved their ability to deliver ordnance and operate from better airfields as infrastructure expanded. Gradually, the Mustang was withdrawn from the most hazardous missions. By 1953, as the armistice approached, the era of the P-51 in frontline United States service was coming to an end for the second time. Yet even this withdrawal did not mark the end of its global story. Around the world, Allied nations continued to operate Mustangs well into the 1950s and beyond. Air forces in Latin America, Africa, and Asia value the aircraft for the same reasons Korea had revealed. It was reliable, adaptable, and effective in conflicts that did not demand high-altitude jet combat. In some countries, the Mustang became the backbone of national air defense and ground attack capability. These aircraft participated in regional conflicts, border skirmishes, and internal security operations long after their designers could have imagined. In civilian life, the Mustang found another afterlife. Restored examples became prized warbirds flown at airshows and commemorative events. Aviation museums displayed them as symbols of industrial ingenuity and wartime sacrifice. Pilots and historians alike spoke of the Mustang as one of the most balanced fighter designs ever created. Its legacy was not defined solely by victory in Europe or tragedy at Cleveland or sacrifice in Korea, but by an extraordinary ability to adapt. The story of the P-51 Mustang is ultimately a lesson in how history repurposes technology. Born from urgency, refined in total war, discarded in peace, and resurrected in crisis, it refused to die quietly. Each phase of its existence reflected the needs and fears of the era it served. As jets came to dominate the skies, the Mustang transitioned from cutting-edge weapon to historical icon. Its second life in Korea ensured that it would not be remembered only as a relic of World War II, but as a bridge between eras. Today, surviving Mustangs still fly, their engines echoing across airfields, not as tools of war, but as living history. Their presence invites reflection on the human stories bound to metal and fuel. The pilots who flew them in Korea carried the weight of an aircraft whose time had passed, yet whose service was demanded again. Their losses underscore the cost of adaptation and the dangers of forcing old solutions into new problems. Even so, the Mustang delivered when it mattered. It remains one of the most adaptable and enduring combat aircraft in aviation history. In the late 1940s, as the roar of piston engines still echoed across American cities and crowds packed airfields in celebration of victory and speed, a single moment arrived that seemed to close a chapter forever. In September 1949, at the Cleveland National Air Races, a polished silver P-51 Mustang sliced through the Ohio sky at breathtaking speed, its Merlin engine screaming with the confidence of a machine that had once ruled the skies over Europe. The aircraft was called Begin, and at its controls sat Bill Odom, a celebrated wartime aviator and long-distance flyer whose name carried the weight of adventure and post-war optimism. This was supposed to be a triumphant demonstration of skill, technology, and the golden age of air racing, but within seconds history took a darker turn. As spectators watched the Mustang streak past the pylons, something went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft rolled violently, lost control, and plunged into a residential neighborhood just beyond the racecourse. The explosion destroyed a home, killed Bill Odom, and claimed the lives of a woman and her child inside the house. Another resident later died from injuries. In that instant, the romance of unlimited air racing collided with the sobering reality of risk, and the P-51 Mustang became the symbol of a tragedy that shook the nation. The Cleveland air race disaster of 1949 did more than end lives, it ended an era. Newspapers across the United States carried photographs of wreckage scattered among suburban streets, and editorials questioned whether high-speed air racing still had a place in a society now uneasy with wartime machines flying over civilian homes. Federal aviation authorities responded swiftly, imposing new safety regulations that effectively shut down the unlimited class that had made aircraft like the Mustang famous in peacetime. For many Americans, this crash confirmed what they already suspected, that the age of propeller-driven heroes was over. Jets were coming, the future was faster and higher, and the old war horses seemed out of place in a modern world. The P-51 Mustang, once the decisive long-range escort fighter of World War II, appeared to have reached the end of its story. Only a few years earlier, Mustangs had escorted American bombers deep into Nazi Germany, changing the course of the air war with their speed, range, and firepower. They were credited with destroying thousands of enemy aircraft and securing air superiority for the Allied invasion of Europe. Pilots spoke of the Mustang with reverence and fear, knowing it could outclimb, outrun, and outfight nearly anything it faced. Yet by 1949, that legacy felt distant. The United States Army Air Forces had become the United States Air Force, and its leadership was focused on jet propulsion, nuclear strategy, and the promise of supersonic flight. In this climate, the Cleveland crash became a powerful metaphor. Here was a machine born in desperation, refined in combat, and celebrated in victory, now crashing into the quiet domestic landscape of post-war America. The public reaction was intense and emotional. Air racing had once been seen as a continuation of wartime heroism, a place where veterans tested themselves and technology pushed limits. After Cleveland, it was increasingly viewed as reckless. Insurance companies withdrew support, cities refused permits, and the crowds dwindled. The Mustang, which had been adapted for racing with clipped wings and boosted engines, was suddenly portrayed as dangerous and outdated. Aviation magazines that once praised modified P-51 racers now questioned whether such aircraft should ever fly again outside museums. To many observers, this was the final confirmation that the Mustang was finished not only as a racing aircraft, but as a frontline fighter. Stored examples sat idle at bases like Davis-Monthan, surrounded by desert sun, their aluminum skins dulling as jets took over the runways. Military planners wrote reports describing piston fighters as obsolete in the face of modern air defense. The Cleveland disaster sealed that perception in the public mind. Yet history has a way of defying neat conclusions. While the crash marked the symbolic end of America's golden age of air racing, it did not mark the end of the P-51 Mustang itself. Beneath the wreckage and headlines lay an aircraft whose story was not finished. The same qualities that made the Mustang dangerous at racing speeds also made it durable, adaptable, and brutally effective when circumstances demanded. Unknown to those watching the smoke rise over Cleveland, the world was already drifting toward another conflict, one that would challenge assumptions about air power and resurrect a machine many believed had nothing left to give.